Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about some of the obvious differences between what we today call a Baroque bassoon and a classical one. We'll also hear an interesting account from Etienne Auzy, published in 1787, about the differences between what he calls an ancient bassoon and a modern one. So, are you ready for this?
It's morphin' time! Brontosaurus!
At the beginning of the 18th century, bassoons were relatively new instruments outside of France, and while none of the first generations of bassoons exist, and only little information is available for us to be able to say exactly when the bassoon was first invented, it is fair to say that bassoons were most likely first built in or near Paris sometime in the 1660s and 70s, possibly by the Hotteterre family. The earliest instruments had only three keys: the low B flat key, the low D key, and the low F key. Many examples from the first half of the 18th century that have survived have a fourth key, that is the low G sharp or A flat key for the right hand little finger. Today, makers of most modern copies of Baroque instruments add a fifth key, the low E flat, as it can be quite technically challenging to play a low E flat without one. The low E flat also doubles as a response key or a resonance key, which can help better tune certain notes on the instrument. On my Baroque bassoon, as well as many others, the low E flat key is placed in the French manner, i.e. for the left-hand thumb on the inside of the low D key. Some original instruments also have low E flat keys for the left-hand little finger, usually German instruments, as well as for the left-hand thumb on the outside of the low D key, usually English instruments. But what is the difference between a Baroque bassoon and a classical bassoon, i.e. a bassoon used for the music of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven? The answer is, well, it's complicated. Depending on where you lived in Europe, bassoon-making design could be at the leading edge or decades behind. In Paris, near the end of the 18th century, for example, the leading bassoon maker Dominique Anthony Porteau might have been influenced by the workshop of Brunner and Keller in Strasbourg, which had clearly won the praise of one notable bassoonist. Etienne Auzy, who you've heard me speak about before, in his 1787 Méthode nouvelle et raisonnée pour le basson, contains two fingering charts, one for instruments anciens, or those made by Bizet and Prud'hon, etc., and another for instruments modernes. The respective charts come with corresponding sketches of bassoons, and though they look very similar, there are one or two differences in the keywork. Here you can see that the placement of the low A-flat tone hole has been moved to below the G-sounding tone hole. On the other side of the boot joint, you can also see that a resonance key has been added below the F-sounding tone hole, which today we might call the F-sharp key. Later in the text, Auzy explains the advantages to what he calls the modern instrument.
The instrument that I regularly play on is by Keller in Strasbourg, which is different from the instruments made in Paris. Firstly, by the G-sharp A-flat key. The new placement is more stable, better sounding, and is better in tune than the others, and it is also useful for the F in the tenor register as well as the A above it. The tone hole is larger, and in combination with the bocal of large caliber, consequently gives a bigger sound. I also use a small key added to the boot joint to raise the pitch of the low G sharp, which is usually too flat on most bassoons. By using it, I avoid accidentally raising the pitch on the surrounding notes. This key is also useful for the high B flat. I shouldn't need to speak about the key on the wing joint, as almost all of us use it. Those who want to hit the high B and C without this key have great trouble, as these tones are not natural to the instrument, and, without the added key, they can only speak by pinching the lips on reeds which can play in the high register easily. Rarely are those reeds good for the low register. Only with the wing joint key can those notes play as easily as they must, as easily as the high F, G, and A. I don't want to give the impression to the reader that the bassoons of others are no good. I have had a number of bassoons made by Monsieur Porteau, an instrument maker in Paris, which is true to the model of mine. Each person can make their own determinations on whichever maker or instrument they want, as one will get used to what they have out of habit, and I am not trying to convince anyone.
Now, it's clear from surviving examples of bassoons by Porteau that an update in the design took place probably sometime in the last 2 decades of the 18th century. But of course, we are talking about the end of the 18th century. Even on that depiction of Ozzy's table of the ancient bassoons, does the instrument have a vent key built onto the wing joint for the left-hand thumb? Obviously, there is an allusion in Ozzy's text that some bassoons in use didn't have that key even at the time of writing, 1787. These days, when we talk about the classical period in music history, we often mean 1750 to 1820, or even the death of Beethoven in 1827, but these dates are arbitrary, and the more you know about the time, the styles, and the musicians, the more you realize that the barriers that we build today were not existent then, and that changes in tastes and in instrument construction were fluid. Think of it this way. Pierre Cugnier, who we heard about in last week's episode, could have played side by side near the end of his career with a young Etienne Ozzy. They certainly were on the same musical scene in Paris for a time. Cugnier was 14 years Ozzy's senior and would have had access to instruments like those made by the Parisian Thierry Prud'hon. Likely his instruments didn't have a wing joint vent key, or if so, one would have been added later. By the time we get to later repertoire, then it is relatively safe to say that a 6 or 7 key instrument with a narrower bore and built to a slightly higher pitch level than an instrument built in the first half of the 18th century would be the go-to instrument. These days, the most common instruments in use in professional circles of this style would be modeled after instruments made in the Grenser workshop at the end of the 18th century or beginning of the 19th century. My instrument, for example, is modeled in part on one instrument stamped Grenser Wiesner from Dresden sometime between 1817 and 1822. Though the original has a number of extra keys, it seems to be the case that even as late as the 1820s, the bore dimensions themselves hadn't been tweaked very much since the end of the previous century. The tone hole placements match those which appear on Ozzy's modern bassoon fingering chart, and his description of the functions or consequences of the new tone hole placements aligns exactly with my own experience. Now, there's still so much to talk about on this subject. Vocal sizes, reed lengths, what weird and wonderful key additions are seen on exceptional instruments or engravings. But what I want for you to take away from this video is that there was no sudden and uniform change across the continent at 12:01 a.m. January 1st, 1750.
3, 2, 1, happy 2000!
Here's your package, Mr. Burns. My name is the return address, you senseless dunderpate.
The bassoon did evolve, but only over the course of a 70-year period were those technological advances adopted into the mainstream. It was in Europe's major musical centers like Paris or Potsdam, Mannheim, Dresden, Vienna, where ambitious players needed to be at the top of their game, so to speak, in order to meet the expectations of their audiences. And it's no coincidence then that those locations are where the most recognizable names in the 18th and early 19th century woodwind makers resided. So there is definitely much more to be done on this subject on this channel. Please let me know in the comments if you want to hear more and on what in particular. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider becoming a patron via Patreon, and don't forget to like right here on YouTube, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.